Emily Carter was folding laundry on a quiet Monday morning when the sound of paper sliding under her apartment door broke the calm, and in that small moment she felt a strange tension she could not explain, as if the air itself had shifted. She wiped her hands, walked to the door, and picked up a plain white envelope with handwriting she knew too well, handwriting she had once loved, handwriting that now made her chest tighten before she even opened it, and she stood there for a few seconds. Unsure, because 2 years had passed since the divorce, 2 peaceful, carefully rebuilt years where she had learned how to breathe on her own again, where Daniel Carter existed only as a distant memory tied to old photos and packed away emotions, and yet this envelope felt heavy, as if it carried more than words. She finally opened it and began to read, and with every line her shoulders stiffened because the tone was not gentle, not respectful, not the calm voice she remembered from long talks. Late at night, but sharp and cold, questioning her choices, her independence, her version of their shared past, and it felt like being judged by someone who once promised to protect her heart, and she moved slowly to the edge of her bed, sitting down as if her legs could no longer carry her, the paper trembling slightly in her hands as she reached the part where Daniel spoke about disappointment, about feeling held back, about how he believed she had changed for the worse, and Emily felt a quiet ache rise inside her, not loud enough to cry yet, but deep enough to hurt, because she had worked so hard to rebuild herself after the marriage ended, had accepted her mistakes, had forgiven his, and had believed that even if love faded, respect would remain. Her mind drifted back to the early years when Daniel used to leave warm notes on the kitchen counter, reminding her to smile or wishing her a good day, and the contrast between those memories and the words in her hands felt almost unreal, like reading a message written by a stranger wearing a familiar name, and she wondered when that change had happened, when kindness had turned into blame without warning. The letter did not shout, did not insult directly, but its calm tone made it worse, because it sounded certain, final, as if Daniel had already decided who she was and what their story meant, and Emily folded the letter slowly, carefully, as though rough handling might make the pain sharper, and placed it on the bedside table, staring at it as if it might speak again, as if another explanation might appear if she waited long enough. The apartment felt smaller now, quieter in an uncomfortable way, and she stood up and walked to the window, watching cars pass below, strangers moving through their own lives without knowing that a single letter had just reopened a chapter she thought was closed, and she felt a mix of confusion and sadness because she had not expected this from him, not now, not after all. The silence that followed their divorce, silence she believed meant peace. She asked herself if this letter was written from anger, regret, or something unfinished, and that question lingered without answer, settling into her thoughts as she remembered the last day of their marriage, how they signed papers with calm faces, promising to move on with dignity, and she realized that promise had been broken not with loud words, but with quiet cruelty. Emily pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, breathing slowly, reminding herself that she was no longer the woman who depended on his approval, that she had built a new life piece by piece, yet the pain remained because words from someone who once mattered always carry weight. No matter how strong you become, she wondered why Daniel chose this moment to speak, why now, when she had finally stopped checking her phone for his name, when she had begun to feel steady again, and she felt a wave of disappointment stronger than anger, because anger fades, but disappointment settles deep, making you question the truth of what you once believed. She picked up the letter again and read it once more, searching for softness, for regret, for anything that sounded like the man she loved, but found only distance and judgment, and she realized that sometimes people rewrite the past to protect themselves, even if it hurts others. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, marking time that felt heavier than usual, and Emily knew this letter would not be easy to forget, that it would follow her through the day, into her thoughts, into quiet moments. When her guard was down, and as she placed the letter back on the table and straightened her posture, she made a silent decision not to respond right away, not to let emotion guide her next move, because she had learned through loss that strength often comes from patience. But even as she told herself this, a single question stayed with her, repeating softly in her mind like an echo she could not silence. Why had the man who once loved her chosen meanness now, when kindness would have cost him nothing? And as that question lingered, Emily sensed that this letter was not the end of something, but the beginning of an emotional storm she had not prepared for, one that would force her to face not only her past with Daniel, but the fragile line between love, memory, and the unexpected pain of being misunderstood by someone who once knew her best. Daniel Carter sat alone in his townhouse on the edge of Seattle, the late afternoon light cutting through the window as he stared at his phone, refreshing the screen even though he already knew there would be no reply, because Emily had always taken time before responding when something hurt her, and this silence, heavy and stretched, felt louder than any argument they had ever had. He told himself the letter was necessary, that he had only said what he felt for years, but the truth pressed against him in uncomfortable ways, because the moment the envelope left his hands, a quiet doubt had followed, asking whether honesty without care was still honesty or just another way to hide pain behind sharp words. Daniel walked through his living room, past furniture that still carried traces of his married life, small marks on the wall where photos once hung, spaces that looked clean but felt unfinished, and he realized that even after 2 years, the idea of being fully free from Emily was something he talked about more than he actually felt. He tried to distract himself by working longer hours, meeting friends, planning trips he might never take, but memory slipped in without warning, reminding him of rainy mornings when Emily used to make coffee before he woke up, of quiet laughter shared over nothing important, of the sense of being understood without needing to explain himself. And these memories annoyed him because they softened the anger he had used to justify the letter. He told himself she had changed, that she had become distant toward the end of the marriage, but deep down he knew he had changed too, becoming quieter, more closed, choosing silence instead of effort, and now that silence had turned into regret disguised as blame. Days passed without a message, and Daniel convinced himself that Emily was ignoring him on purpose, which made him defensive, even though a small part of him knew she was simply protecting herself, something he once admired about her. Meanwhile, Emily went on with her life in Portland, showing up to work, sharing polite smiles, keeping her thoughts private, but Daniel could sense her absence in ways that surprised him, because it felt heavier now than it had during the years they avoided contact, as if reopening the door had reminded him of what was still unresolved. One evening, while visiting a bookstore in Seattle after work, Daniel froze when he saw Emily standing a few aisles away, her hair slightly longer than he remembered, her posture calm but guarded, and for a second he felt like time folded in on itself, placing them back into a shared past they both pretended no longer mattered. She looked up, their eyes met, and in that brief moment he saw something he did not expect, not anger, not sadness, but distance, the kind that comes from learning how to survive without someone, and it unsettled him more than any argument ever had. They exchanged simple words, nothing emotional, nothing warm, but Daniel noticed how careful her tone was, how she chose each word with control, and when she walked away, he felt a strange pull in his chest, realizing that the power he once believed he had over her emotions no longer existed. That night, he replayed the meeting again and again, thinking about how easily he could have chosen kindness instead of accusation, how easily he could have written a different letter, and for the first time since the divorce, he admitted to himself that the anger he carried was less about Emily and more about his own failure to communicate when it mattered most. Emily, back in her hotel room after the unexpected encounter, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, feeling the weight of unfinished feelings settle into her chest, not because she wanted Daniel back, but because seeing him reminded her that some wounds close quietly while others wait patiently for the right moment to reopen. She remembered the man he used to be, the one who listened, who tried, and it confused her to see how easily kindness had turned into judgment, leaving her to question whether the love they shared had ever been as safe as she believed. Daniel lay awake that same night, staring at the ceiling, understanding too late that words, once written, cannot be folded away as neatly as paper, and that his letter had not given him relief, only clarity, showing him that moving on requires more than time. It requires courage, accountability, and the ability to face your own reflection without blame. As the city outside settled into silence, both of them felt the same unspoken truth forming in their thoughts, that whatever they had tried to bury was still alive beneath the surface, waiting not for anger or defense, but for honesty spoken with care. And neither of them knew whether they were ready to face what came next, only that something had shifted, and the calm they once relied on was no longer enough to keep the past from finding its way back into the present. Emily agreed to meet Daniel not because she felt ready, but because silence had begun to feel heavier than truth, and when they sat across from each other in a quiet cafe in Vancouver, the space between them felt crowded with everything they had not said for years. Snow rested softly outside the window, the city moving slowly, while inside the cafe time felt sharp and awake, and Daniel noticed how composed Emily looked, calm in a way that suggested she had learned to carry pain without showing it, which made his chest tighten with something close to regret. They started with small talk about work and travel, careful and distant, like strangers borrowing familiar names, until Emily finally looked at him and spoke in a low, steady voice, telling him she never expected such meanness from him, not after everything they had shared, and those words landed harder than anger because they were honest, quiet, and true. Daniel felt exposed in that moment, realizing that what he called honesty had reached her as cruelty, and he admitted he had written the letter from a place of unresolved anger, from feeling left behind while pretending he had moved on, and as he spoke, his voice lacked defense for the first time, sounding tired instead. Emily listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around a warm cup she barely touched, and she told him that the letter had made her question herself, not because she believed all of it, but because it came from someone who once knew her deeply. And that kind of judgment leaves marks even when you grow stronger. Daniel looked down, understanding too late that words do not fade just because time passes, and he apologized, not with excuses, but with acknowledgement, admitting that he had rewritten the past to protect his pride, blaming her so he would not have to face his own silence during the marriage. The conversation moved quickly then, years of distance collapsing into honesty as they spoke about how they slowly stopped choosing each other, how love did not end suddenly but faded through missed chances and unspoken needs, and Emily admitted she had felt lonely even when they were together, while Daniel confessed he had been afraid to say he felt the same. There were no raised voices, no dramatic moments, only a deep sadness for what might have been different if they had known then what they knew now. And as the cafe filled with quiet sounds around them, Emily realized she no longer felt angry, only clear, which surprised her because clarity felt lighter than she expected. Daniel, watching her closely, said he never stopped caring, not in the way that demands something, but in the way that lingers quietly, and the words hung between them, gentle but dangerous, because they carried possibility without promise. Emily did not answer right away, feeling the familiar pull of memory mixed with the caution she had learned through healing, and she stood slowly, telling him she appreciated the honesty but needed time, because growth does not mean returning to the past, and forgiveness does not always mean starting over. They walked outside together, the cold air sharp against their faces, and stood there for a moment without touching, without moving, two people who once shared everything now unsure what was allowed, and Daniel understood then that care does not grant access, and that respect sometimes means letting someone choose distance. Emily turned to leave, her steps steady, and as she walked away, Daniel felt a quiet shift inside him, realizing that speaking the truth had not given him control or relief, but something more difficult, responsibility for how his actions shaped another person's healing. Later that night, Emily sat alone in her hotel room, looking out at the city lights, replaying the conversation not with longing, but with understanding, recognizing that love can exist without return, and that meeting Daniel had shown her how far she had come, not because she felt nothing, but because she could feel without losing herself. Daniel, back in Seattle days later, carried the weight of that meeting with him, not as pain, but as a lesson, knowing that some apologies come too late to change outcomes, but still matter because they tell the truth, and as both of them moved forward separately, they carried the same quiet awareness that the past had finally been spoken aloud, and whatever came next would no longer be shaped by silence, but by choices made with care, even if those choices led them in different directions. Emily returned to Portland with a calm that felt new, not because everything was resolved, but because the weight she carried for years had finally shifted, and as the city welcomed her back with familiar streets and steady routines, she noticed how differently she moved through her days. Lighter, more aware, no longer haunted by unanswered questions. The meeting with Daniel had not reopened old wounds the way she feared. Instead, it had given her something unexpected, clarity, and as she settled back into work in quiet evenings, she realized she no longer replayed his words with pain, but with understanding, seeing them as part of his struggle rather than a measure of her worth. Daniel, back in Seattle, found himself paying attention to small things he once ignored, the tone he used with others, the way he spoke when frustrated, and he recognized how easily sharp words can create distance, and how difficult it is to rebuild trust once it is lost. Even when intentions change, they began to exchange brief messages, nothing emotional, nothing heavy, simple check-ins that respected boundaries, and Emily appreciated the restraint, understanding that growth often shows itself through what people choose not to say. Some evenings, she stood by her window watching the city lights reflect on wet streets, thinking about how love can end without disappearing completely, changing shape instead of vanishing, and she accepted that feeling without letting it control her, knowing that maturity often means holding emotion without acting on it. Daniel, during long walks through his neighborhood, reflected on the marriage with a new lens, seeing both the good and the quiet damage caused by avoidance, and he promised himself that if he ever loved again, he would choose honesty early, not as defense, but as care. Weeks passed, and the silence between messages felt comfortable rather than tense. A sign that neither of them was waiting for something more, and yet the respect that grew in that space felt deeper than the anger that once filled it. Emily received a promotion at work, celebrated with friends, and noticed how little she thought about Daniel during moments of joy, which felt like progress rather than loss, and when his name did cross her mind, it no longer carried confusion, only appreciation for what the past had taught her. Daniel attended a family gathering and spoke openly about his divorce for the first time without blame, acknowledging his mistakes with honesty, and the relief he felt afterward told him that growth does not come from defending the past, but from learning from it. One evening, Emily and Daniel spoke on the phone briefly, their conversation easy and respectful, and when they ended the call, neither felt the pull to hold on longer, understanding that connection does not always mean return. As autumn turned to winter, Emily walked through her neighborhood wrapped in a warm coat, breathing in cold air and realizing that her heart felt steady, no longer shaped by what she had lost, but by what she had gained through resilience, patience, and self-trust. Daniel, sitting alone with a cup of coffee one morning, finally accepted that kindness is not proven through regret, but through consistent behavior, and he felt grateful that Emily had allowed him the space to change, even without promises. Their story did not end with reunion or dramatic farewell, but with something quieter and stronger: mutual respect, understanding, and the acceptance that some relationships complete their purpose without needing to continue. Emily smiled to herself one evening as she closed her laptop and turned off the lights, feeling at peace with the knowledge that she could love deeply, heal fully, and move forward without bitterness. And in another city, Daniel looked out at the sky with the same quiet awareness, knowing that while their paths no longer ran side by side, the lessons they shared would guide them both toward kinder futures, and in that shared understanding, their story found its true ending, not in romance renewed, but in dignity, growth, and the quiet strength of letting go with grace.